Okay, I'd like to introduce Kirby Quam. Kirby is with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Sciences, and I'll let you tell everybody what you do, and I'll let you share your slides. Kirby, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Rod. Thank you for having me, inviting me to be a part of this. That's a really neat class you got going. And thanks everybody for lending me some of your time. We were just talking about vegetable production, just so I can get sort of a baseline here of where everybody's at. Could you do some sort of reaction or raised hand if you are in vegetable or fruit or vegetable production or considering fruit or vegetable production? See a thumbs up there. Oh, never mind. Okay. Cool. All right. So we've got some. I heard you guys talking about cattle earlier and cattle getting out. It took me back to my days in Senegal. My wife and I were Peace Corps volunteers in West Africa. We lived in a community with a lot of cattle as well as sheep and goats. And goats were, of course, notoriously the most mischievous and adept at getting out. And we used to like to say that if you wanted to know if your fence was goat proof, take a bucket of water and throw it at the fence. And if water goes through, a goat could get through. But anyway, I think I'm going to jump right into it here. I don't have a ton of time and I got a lot of stuff I want to talk about. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Hope everybody can see that now. Should be coming up. So again, as Rod said, my name is Kirby Quam. I work for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And specifically, I work with our produce safety team. So tonight, I just want to give you a quick overview of our produce safety program, some of the insights, main tidbits that I think you need to take away from a regulator's perspective, and then some on-farm food safety considerations. I also want to point out that the Florida Department of FDACS is a really big department. We have 18 different divisions and offices, I think over 4,500 employees. And we touch pretty much every corner of Florida's ag industry and beyond. So I know you guys are going to have an opportunity in the coming weeks to hear from Ellen Cruz, and she'll be able to give you a really great overview. She's a regional director in the commissioner's office. So I know she can give an overview of all these divisions and how they can work with you and for you to support your operation. But my little corner of the department is trying to move the icons. There we go. Is up here in the division of fruit and vegetables. We have a small team working with our produce safety program, just a handful of inspectors. But no matter what your operation is, no matter what your production system is, or what division within our department is, I think you'll find that we have some shared values. And one thing that motivates me is this idea of increasing food security. So again, I don't have a lot of time I wish we could parse out this definition and take it just a few words at a time and really dissect it. I think it's a great definition for food security. But what I wanted to point out here is that food security really rests on these three pillars of availability, access, and utilization. Availability meaning, can we produce enough food for our communities? Access, can we then get that food from the farm to the market and ultimately to the consumer? And then utilization, is it being utilized properly so that everyone has their dietary needs to live an active life? All of that resting on stability of our government and our supply chain, and part of that being regulations, food safety regulations, and produce safety regulations being a part of that. They run a thread through each of these. If we can't produce our food safely, then we don't have food security. And the same with access and utilization. So I just wanted to, that's really just a little pep talk for myself as we get into things here. But for those of you who are in fruit and vegetable production or who are considering it, you'll know that produce and fresh fruits and vegetables have their own challenges inherent to them when it comes to food safety. Number one being that these are commodities that are consumed raw, right? There's going to be no kill step between the farm and the consumer's plate. And so there's a potential risk there, right? In that whatever hazards or contamination was present on the farm that piece of fruit might have come into contact with is then with our consumer. As well, it's really difficult to trace these things back if there is ever an outbreak and to detect. And imagine if you just look at these zoomed in pieces of fruit as well, all of the nooks and crannies and sheer surface area that we have where a microorganism, or particularly in our case, we're thinking about microorganisms that could be potentially pathogenic. They might set up shop and make a home for themselves. So there's a lot of risks and challenges here. Not to mention the environment that we grow our food is, whether that's outside or indoors in a controlled environment ag setting. We ourselves can be very efficient vectors of pathogens, as well as, we can have contamination in our soil, particularly where there's byproducts from animals themselves, whether that's domesticated animals on the farm or wildlife intrusion into your production areas. There can be contamination sources in our buildings and our equipment, our harvest bins, our front end loaders, or particularly if we're in a pack house, right? Then we have a high volume there going through. But then another huge consideration here in terms of contamination sources is water. And water has the propensity to take a small contamination issue and spread it over our entire field or throughout all of our crop and making it a really large contamination issue in a hurry. And so, when I'm talking about microorganisms and pathogenic microorganisms here, I'm talking about these headline makers, the heavy hitters. These are the ones that we are looking at and dealing with. Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, Cyclospora. These are things that you've seen in the headlines associated with fresh produce. And for most of us, myself and many of us, we may deal with a food poisoning event or an event that we suspect might be food poisoning on our own, and handle that privately. And often it goes unreported. So these are pretty, I think, grossly actually underreported statistics here. But particularly for those immunocompromised in our communities, elderly, children, pregnant women, these illnesses can lead to hospitalization and even death. And so it's a really high public health concern. And as well, there are so many different commodities that have been associated with outbreaks, right? Here we've got maybe a dozen listed, not to mention there's that piece of the pie that's the other category where we have, who knows how many commodities that have been associated with these multi-state outbreaks. And as I've already mentioned, this is pretty underreported. And if you look closely, you'll notice that each of these commodities in this pie chart are grown commercially in Florida. So we are not immune to these risks and these hazards. Although, what's making the headlines lately seems to be leafy greens and lettuce coming out of the West Coast, Salinas Valley, California, Yuma, Arizona. We here in Florida are not immune to these risks. And so it's things that we have to keep in mind. And it's from that and from those headlines that was born this Food Safety Modernization Act, or you may hear it referred to as FSMA. And FSMA was passed, it's about a 10-year-old piece of legislation. It was passed during the Obama administration. Many rules a part of FSMA that cover pretty much, every part of our food supply chain. But the one that we are focused on our team in the Division of Fruit and Vegetables is that produce safety rule. So here we're looking at fresh fruits and vegetables. And this shocked me, but this was the FSMA produce safety rule, the first ever federally mandated standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding fresh produce. Before that's pretty much the Wild West. There were some industry checks and balances, and we'll talk about the audits that are required by buyers. But pretty surprising that only within the last 10 years do we have rules about fresh produce safety. Now I'll say that this regulation really does just set the baseline. It's our safety net to ensure that all fresh fruit and vegetable farms across the country at least meet this standard. So I'm not going to get into, again, the nitty gritty of all the different requirements of the rule and the standards of the rule. For one thing, it's going to look different on every farm. No two farms are alike. And as well, we have other trainings that I'm going to tell you about, which I would strongly recommend taking advantage of and looking into those opportunities. I know Jess is on the call tonight. She's part of that training cadre that does those trainings. But the reason I have all the subparts of the rule up here is just to show that the rule really does address, or at least tries to address, each of those contamination areas that we were looking at earlier. Humans, we're talking about worker training, health and hygiene, agricultural water standards, the regulations and requirements for any soil amendments of animal origin, domesticated and wild animal intrusion, and on and on. It really does try to address all of those contamination sources because, like I said earlier, at the end of the day, we really all have the same goal of producing, I should say, that good quality and safe food for our families and for our community. And so that's what we're striving for here. And that's what FDA was aiming for with this rule as well. I know it's cumbersome to have additional regulations, but just hitting home that the spirit of this, I think, it is shared by growers alike. And I also wanted to say here, well, I lost my train of thought, so I'm going to move on. It'll come back to me, I'm sure. So what you need to know here, I think, first and foremost, is who's covered by the produce safety rule. I could say it simply that all farms that grow, harvest, pack, and hold fresh produce are covered by the produce safety rule, but there are some exemptions worth noting. First of all, there's a list that FDA has based on data from USDA. It's the rarely consumed raw list. So these are crops that we know virtually all of them are going to be cooked. I'll use eggplant as an example. If on your farm you solely produce eggplant, that's all you produce. I know that eggplant's on that rarely consumed raw list, meaning that we know that almost all the eggplant's going to be cooked or otherwise processed before it gets to a plate. So if that's all you did, you would not be subject to the produce safety rule and you would not get a produce safety rule inspection. But if you had eggplant and peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers, now we've got some commodities in there that are consumed raw. And so you would then again be subject to the produce safety rule inspection. But there's also exemptions for processing. So if 100% of your produce again goes to further processing, some kind of value added product, or say you grow all tomatoes and all of 100% of those tomatoes go to make tomato paste, or you have a small orange grove and 100% of your fruit goes to orange juice, then there's a kill step in there. There's a processing step. And so you again would be exempt from the rule. But we don't go out and parse out, well, this block is for fresh and this block is for process. If any of typically how it works anyway is that the highest quality, produce goes to the fresh market, and then the second cut goes for processing. But we're not going to go out and again parse out your block. So if you have any of your crop that's going to the fresh market, then you would be covered by the rule. But there's also these exemptions that I think that you might fall under, especially at first as you're starting your farm, a fresh fruit or vegetable farm. And one is being micro exempt. So under $25,000 annual sales, you would be exempt from the rule. We call it a micro exemption. That's not an official term, but just meaning you're a very, very small farm in the eyes of the FDA. And so not going to make a big enough splash, I guess, in their eyes in terms of an outbreak, but also it can be prohibitive to introduce some of these practices on a small farm, cost prohibitive that is. And so they didn't want to make it cost prohibitive for small farms to continue to do business in their communities. There's also this qualified exemption, which gets a little bit more complicated, but again, I think might be very interesting to those of you in this class considering fresh fruit or vegetable production. And that's going to be under $500,000 annual sales. That's on average over a 3-year average. And this exemption is really for those farms who are selling locally within 275 miles of their farm, and they're selling direct to consumer. So whether it's at a farmer's market or in a CSA box, or even direct to a retail store or a restaurant, as long as it's not going to distribution or wholesale, you might qualify for this qualified exemption, where only some of the regulations, there are some requirements in the produce safety rule, but you would not be subject to a produce safety rule inspection. I mentioned third-party audits earlier. I'm going to go through this just really quickly, but to enter certain markets, if you want to sell to certain retailers, they're going to require a third-party audit. And there are all different kinds of audit schemes, GAPS or Primus, GFSI audits. What you really want to check with is your buyer. If you are going to sell to a retail store, that's the market you're trying to enter, then you want to check with them what audits they require and what's going to be a good fit for your farm. We call them voluntary. It may not feel like voluntary if your buyers is requiring it, but we consider it voluntary because you're opting into these audits in order to enter those markets. That's really a business decision where you'll get a score and an auditor will come out and based on the score and their checklist, they'll determine if your operation is, passes the bar to sell to that, whoever that buyer is. Whereas the inspection is different in that it's regulatory, it's mandatory. Again, it's that safety net. The third-party audit standards typically exceed our produce safety rule. So anyway, keep that in mind as well. And this is probably the most important slide that I'll show in this whole talk. We do these produce safety trainings. It's a Produce Safety Alliance grower training is the official term. Because the Produce Safety Alliance is the one who developed the curriculum. I mentioned earlier, Jess is a part of this training cadre. We are really, truly blessed in the state of Florida to have our IFAS extension I have talked to my counterparts in other state departments of agriculture, and they always remind me how blessed we are. We do have some of the leading national experts. So kudos to Jess and Rod and all of the extension agents. We, in terms of produce safety, we have some of the leading national experts, and they are a part of the team that delivers this training. Really great and rich curriculum where you learn good agricultural practices, all of the requirements that you would need specifically for your farm for the produce safety rule. And I think I mentioned that this is actually a required training for farms who are covered by the rule. We do a mix of in-person trainings and remote trainings. So it's an 8-hour course. It's an intensive, but again, a really, really great training for anybody who's growing fresh fruits and vegetables for sale. Strongly recommend this, whether or not you're covered by the rule. This 8-hour training during the day, it would be a 1-day course. Lunch would be provided, as well as some materials that you would take home with you. For the remote trainings, if you're not able to make it to one of those in-person trainings, and I believe Immokalee is probably going to be the closest one for most of you, at least this fall. We mix it up a little bit. But again, for the remote trainings, what I was going to say is that we break that up. 8 hours is a long time to sit at a computer, so we break it up and just do a few hours each day in the afternoon, so you can get whatever you need to get done in the morning, and then join us in the afternoon for this training. Strongly recommend this training for all of you, particularly if you're going to be producing fresh fruits and vegetables or already are. In addition to that, we'll come out for free and do what we call an on-farm readiness review. This is a walkthrough with a member of our team, as well as a member from the extension team, IFAS, and we can really walk through your operation, answer any questions that you have as they pertain to produce safety, point out any areas or highlight any areas that we see that might be risk areas or that might be non-compliance areas, and help you get ready for that inspection or any audits that you might be anticipating. These are completely free. We take a strictly educational approach with these. So when we come to the farm, we're not there in a regulatory capacity other than just to offer our regulatory perspective. I didn't imagine that I would be a regulator, but I have become very familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations, at least this particular part of it. And I can tell you, knowing it inside and out, that you could read through the entire rule and still have questions about how it applies to your farm specifically. Because remember, it was written for farms all across the country. So this is a really great opportunity to have those questions answered and to feel assured that you're doing all the right things. And then I just want to point out, in addition, that we have a cornucopia of resources on our website. I would strongly recommend, if you're doing any fresh fruit or vegetable production, to come check this out. We have information about upcoming trainings. There's also that flow chart that was on one of my slides earlier. I know you couldn't read it, but that's what can kind of help you walk through those exemptions and determine whether or not you would be exempt from the rule. And then also this produce safety record keeping booklet, which is a great resource. And you should be keeping records on the farm, whether or not you're covered by the rule. Obviously, there's just a ton of advantages to that. And this would give you all of the resources and all of the templates that you might need if you were covered by the rule. So that's produce safety. Now, within FDEX, I mentioned it's a really big department. We have a whole separate division for food safety. And so they look at the things that Rod was mentioning earlier. For any of you that are considering doing some value-added products, and we can look at some examples of those. This division also does all of our retail food establishment inspections. Anybody who's doing food processing. So if you were turning your fresh fruit into a fruit cup, then you might fall actually under the division of food safety inspections. And there's a line there, and we can talk about kind of parsing out where that line is in terms of the jurisdiction. But now I'm kind of stepping out of my comfort zone, if I can be honest with you guys. Again, my focus is on the fresh fruit and vegetable and produce safety side, but I definitely wanted to provide you with these resources. I pulled these cottage food laws and the food law basics right off of the FDEX food safety website. So here it's linked down here. If you just type in the Google bar there, FDEX cottage foods or FDEX food safety, you're going to find these resources there as well to reference on your own. But just the bottom line is you can do it. You can sell food that you've prepared that qualifies as cottage food, direct to consumer on your website or by mail order. The main thing is you can't sell it wholesale, and it also has to be packaged and labeled appropriately, and that's according to the FD&C Act. But that's another FDA federal law that you would want to look into. But cottage food operators here, it says, also can serve free samples for tasting, but those must be prepackaged. And then I want to point out some of the foods. These are the approved cottage foods. So if you want to take a snapshot, well, you guys are going to have these slides. So, and again, this is all available on the website, but here's a list of the value-added products that are approved cottage food products. And these are going to be less cumbersome in terms of regulations than some of the other processed foods. So these are some good options in terms of that. There are no formal inspections or any permits required for cottage foods. However, FDAX does follow up on complaints and do investigations with those. So that's something important to keep in mind. Of course, we all want to avoid that. Here are the requirements, though, for the labels. Everything a label must have: name and physical address of the operation, the product name, the list of ingredients and descending weight order, the product net weight or volume per package, and any allergens. There are 9 major allergens, and if any of those are in there, those must be declared. I won't quiz you on what those 9 major allergens are if you don't quiz me. And then this must have this cottage food operation statement, and it's explicit there what statement must be on there, printed in no less than 10-point font and contrasting color. And that might sound like a lot, but when you look at an example, it's a label. It's just a label. And again, all of these examples are available on the website. If you have questions specific to cottage foods, I'd be happy to field some of those questions, but I don't know that I'm going to know all the answers, but I would be happy to, if you could send me an email, that would probably be the best way. And I can pass that question on to the right person and get you in touch with the right contact. Produce safety questions, though, I can field confidently if anybody has any of those. Check the chat. I saw something. Oh, thanks, Kevin.
Say, Kirby?
Yes.
I just had a question today, matter of fact, and
Okay.
it is a cottage food type question, and it's a person who's doing baked items, and she wanted to know if she could use pepper powder in that item, in that baked item. And my understanding is that she could, as long as it's dried powder. Now, if she wanted to put apricot pieces or peach pieces or something, then that wouldn't be allowed, correct?
That is an interesting question and specific. Let me go back to these approved, because I believe that dried fruit actually does qualify now, but I don't know about mixing the dried fruit. And Jess may actually know. We are, unfortunately, I know at Extension, kind of in between the cottage food experts. We just had our cottage food expert leave, but you guys do have some great resources, and Rod, you and Jess will know their names. I can't think of their names off the top of my head right now. I'm not sure actually about mixing the dried fruit or dried peppers in the bakery items.
I can jump in if you want.
Fruits. Go ahead, please.
Yeah,
Jess,
hey, Just Riles here. Yeah, so I believe you would be able to, as long as it's baked appropriately. Great. So as long as it's not like a fresh apricot topping that you would have to then store in the refrigerator, but you could bake it as appropriate within that bread or cookie or whatever it is.
Perfect, thank you.
And then the second question this lady had was on salsa and what rules cover making and selling salsa. And I see on the list here pasta. I don't know if it falls in that category or it's something different.
Yeah, I could jump in and answer that too if you want, Kirby.
Please.
Yeah, so salsa is a hard no, mainly because these are promoting sales of foods that have a certain pH and a certain water activity. So when you're thinking about things that you have to store in the refrigerator or you have to can to a certain process, that is not going to be allowed for sales. And because it's mostly things like vegetables have a different pH than something like fruit that you're going to be adding a lot of sugar to, that you're going to be using in like a hot water bath, that's safe for consumption versus something like salsa that you would have to add, you'd have to follow a very specific recipe and make sure that everything goes according to plan in order to sell it. So that would basically have you go through FDAX or DBPR to get a food permit. But the cottage food laws are actually an exemption of food permits.
Thank you, Jess.
Sure.
Another question, Kirby. You mentioned that certain customers might require a food safety plan or an audit or certain licensing. Do you have any examples of who that might be Is it a school? Is it a hospital? Is it all of the above?
They may, some schools and hospitals will. Definitely most retailers, Publix, Winn-Dixie, Costco, Walmart, certainly any wholesale or distribution centers are going to, well, I shouldn't say maybe all, but many of those types of buyers are going to require a third-party audit.
Any other questions from the group? Here's a question in the chat. Would milk, cheese, and eggs be considered cottage?
No, they would not.
That's the-
So yeah, if you go on the FTAX website, it shows you a very, oh, right there, Kirby. Yeah, it shows you a very, very limited things of items that you can actually sell. If it does not fall under these very limited things, it cannot be sold under the cottage food law.
But that doesn't mean you can't sell them. It's just,
That's right. Yeah, you just would need perhaps different permits through FTAX.
correct. Question is honey raw?
Yeah, honey you can sell under the cottage food law. And most of the honey producers around here are selling unpasteurized honey. So I believe that would be considered raw. But again, the properties of honey make it so that it's really difficult for bacteria and microbes to thrive in that environment. Versus, say, beef jerky or, coconut cream pie. If you leave that out, that you could have some problems with food safety.
That's how Winnie the Pooh got away with stuffing his paw in all these open jars of honey.
Yes, I love
Honey's even too sweet for the pathogens, huh?
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not enough oxygen, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I kind of have two questions. One, a follow-up, not salsa, but hot sauce. Would that fall into the category of vinegar, flavored vinegars, or seasonings, mixtures?
No, hot sauce, you would need to go through FDAX or DBPR to get approvals. And it really just depends on what you're doing it, how you're doing it, where you're doing it, and at what volume, depending on that license.
Okay. And then second question, from what I was reading before, there's a revenue or financial threshold to still be considered a cottage annually, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So they just raised it a year or two ago to 250,000,
Okay.
which is pretty good. It used to be 50, but
Right. That's
that's
right. Everything I read was 50. That seemed really low.
yeah. But 250, that's not bad. You could make some money off that.
Thank you.
Another question for Kirby, or we will.
Yeah, I got a question if I'm on the speaker, am I?
Yes.
Yeah. Recently, some people we know were looking at some property and they had a home inspector come look at the property and the wells, and he tested the well water and said each of the wells actually showed E. coli contamination. I talked to a fellow who drills wells in servicing a well, and he said that new wells do get tested, but old wells really never do. Is this something that really happens, and is this something that they keep any records about, or that you need to know about?
So it's not unusual for wells to have there to be some sort of contamination event that might contaminate the well, and you might find E. coli. In terms of, I don't know about public records for all the wells. We do have water use permits for all the wells. Right now, and I could talk about produce safety, currently is not required. Well, they're finalizing the rules still on ag water is the short way to say it. But right now you wouldn't be required necessarily to test your well if you were using it for pre-harvest water, meaning like your irrigation or frost protection or crop sprays. Now, if you did find that there was E. coli or contamination in it from testing, you can shock the well. You can, treat the water to eliminate that contamination, but you're really also going to want to try to do an assessment take a step back. And if you're new to the property, it's going to be difficult. But if it's a property that you know well, you might be able to take a step back, do an assessment, take sort of an assessment of the land use surrounding you, what's happened, maybe weather events, what would have caused that, what would have been the root cause, because just shocking your well is really just treating the symptom. You wouldn't know still where that contamination originated from. But it's not unusual for wells to have contamination like that. So there are treatment options for treating your well. I think it's a great idea to test your water to get an idea of what your water quality sort of profile is. And that could be a great piece of data to have if you were getting a produce safety rule inspection. But yeah, in terms of just, your private well, it can happen that it would be contaminated.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, Kirby. Take care, everyone.